The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. This video is aligned with the following Tennessee academic standards.
Good afternoon. Welcome to MTSU, everyone. I've been told I'm the last person you'll have to listen to. My name's Lynn Nelson. I'm a professor over in the history department here. My specialty is American Revolution and early Republic, particularly the early American frontier. So when Professor Graham asked me to do this presentation, specifically asked me to do something that shows up at so many different levels in your teaching, in the curriculum here in Tennessee, the state of Franklin. All right, so what I'm going to try and do today is give you some ideas about kind of the background and the motivations and the impact of the State of Franklin movement beyond what you can get in the standard textbook, and also try and link it in, as you're noting here, to the overall theme of the TPS program, teaching with primary sources. What I wish students coming into entry-level U.S. history, Tennessee history, understood and knew how to do. Thinking, speaking, analyzing in an historical manner. Okay.
Please don't write in present tense.
So, like Thomas Jefferson is saying, no, he's not. You know why? You know why he's not saying it?
Because he's dead.
Extremely dead. Extremely dead. He's not saying anything. Right? I'll get back to that issue in a moment. It's more than just a kind of ingrained annoyance. It goes to something deeper philosophically. A couple of things that I see my students come in with that I find difficult and frustrating to deal with. One is when they are given a text and asked to analyze it. Okay? Over and over, what I've seen in the practice and what you see in the standards is to take the text in isolation. Okay? Here's a document. Here's a text. Analyze this text. Okay? By itself, on its own. Okay? Now this links up with the fact that yes, so much of this reading instruction, so much of the source analysis is done in English class. Now the thing about the writing in the present tense is that it does go to a rather deeper philosophical divide between these two disciplines of English and history. And that is encased in that idea of the literary present. Okay, the reason you would write about Thomas Jefferson saying things or William Shakespeare writing things is a sort of underlying assumption that through the medium of the text, okay, the author communicates directly to the reader, regardless of, particularly going for historians, the passage of time. Okay, and so in that sense, yeah, if you're reading one of these documents and you turn around and you say Thomas Jefferson is saying, because through the text Thomas Jefferson is speaking. Okay, and that idea is reflected in the use of the literary present as a written form. Okay, yes, it's so galling, as you know. It's so bad. You fall into it too, don't you? I know I do. I get into class and I start doing it myself, all right, even though I'm yelling at my students to stop. Here's the issue for historians when we look at primary sources. To remember that not only is Thomas Jefferson dead, He was, okay, as a rule, not speaking, right, with an eye towards 21st century school students, okay? That's not his audience. Rather, the documents that he and other people of that time period created were part of a conversation. They were addressed to one another. That's the audience they're speaking to, okay? When I say there, I mean they were, not they are, okay? So this runs into, right off the bat, a problem with treating the text in isolation, okay? Students aren't going to get the fullest sense of what the document means if they just take it on its own, okay? You have to put it, okay, fully with the other sources of that time period. Now, the second thing that's problematic for historians about the idea of the literary present, okay, is that massive potential for anachronism. Anytime you yourself find yourself listening in on somebody else's conversation, okay, even if you're getting both sides of it, you can be aware of how little you understand. Because so much that's going on between these two people is based upon language that they share in common, words they understand, past events to which they often don't even need to refer other than a word or two, okay? You're listening in on somebody else's conversation, okay? And in order to understand it, not only do you need both sides of it, if you're listening to a student yakking on their cell phone, all right, you're not going to understand almost anything if you just take their words in isolation. But also you need to broaden out, okay, just from a couple of sources, a few sources, into the whole context, the whole culture of that society at the time, right? To understand the language, understand the structures of the argument, the unspoken assumptions, okay? So this is one of the toughest things I deal with when I'm teaching freshmen and sophomores, right? Is to get them to think, well, if you want to be a good structuralist, think in a synchronic manner, okay? Try and put themselves fully into a time period in the past, okay? Understanding its culture, connecting its ideas, making connections between different texts, different sources, different authors, right, on the terms of that time, okay, rather than looking so much for the connections to the present, okay. One thing I know is, as history educators, you're often taught, you know, how do you engage students? Well, try and make the topic relevant to them. And I'm always cautious about that because I tell my students, look, what were people in the past like? What were they like? I say, they were weird. They didn't think like you do. They didn't talk like I do. They didn't organize their societies or view the world around them in the way that we do today. They were a bunch of weirdos. Or maybe we're the weirdos, okay? And this is one of the great values of the study of history. And is to consider fully the alternatives, okay? So many students, you know, they look at the world around them and it's, well, things are the way that they are. Well, no, they're not. They are the way they are because people in the past made them that way, okay? And did so for reasons that we might not fully understand, and did so in a context, in a world, right, that we don't really share. So, from that, you know, you pass here, or I would try to pass here, sort of a way of looking at or analyzing sources related to the State of Franklin movement. Okay? Now again, a lot of the details, the factual details are present in the textbooks, or you can get them from basic historical sources, names, dates, John Sevier, Reverend Sam Houston, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, I want to tackle, or try to tackle, based on the sources that I handed out here for you, sort of a deeper question about the State of Franklin, okay? Motivations, meaning, Okay? Where did this movement fit into the society, the culture, the language, the issues of the American Revolution and the early American Republic? Right? Now, again, just on the surface, the state of Franklin movement was a conflict between the government of the state of North Carolina and over mountain settlers in what's today Upper East Tennessee. Right? Now, the textbook interpretation, what you're going to find in most readers about it is, well, the state of Franklin movement was about a quest for Western independence, okay? And it was sort of an ancestor, a forerunner of the independent and, of course, democratic state of Tennessee. The issues, the deeper issues, of course, are a lot more complex, right? And a lot more contingent than just on, or contingent on things more than just, the origins of the state of Tennessee, okay? It's buried in some really deep and significant issues involving European settlement in North America, right? And the American Revolution and the creation of the American Republic. And to get a sense of some of that connection, what were the points of conflict? What was Franklin government and policy about? What were the long-term consequences of what was, on the face of it, a failed movement here? You do need to dig into the fuller context and connections between these sources. Right? Now, what I gave you today were three sources that you can see in front of you, excerpts from them, between the leaders of the Franklin movement and the governor of North Carolina at the time. The first one is from leaders of the Franklin Assembly, memorial addressed to North Carolina Governor Alexander Martin. The second from Franklin Governor John Sevier, also addressed to Martin. And third and lastly, selections from a public manifesto that Martin issued in response to what he'd heard from the leaders of the Franklin movement. A manifesto in opposition, right, to their attempt to declare an independent state government. Now, when you look at these sources, okay, just as texts, right, a number of issues, okay, seemingly very specific, rather odd, pop up and seem to be the structure around which these people are arguing, right, and fighting. Okay, and three in particular I want to point to, and if you note there what I hand wrote in the margins, the first, really strange little issue, the apparent non-delivery of Indian trade goods by the North Carolina government to the Cherokee. Second, the question of the inefficient administration of justice, okay, in the over-mountain settlements. Okay. Both of those seem to be, again, rather small points, technical stuff. And you ask, how then does this create a whole movement to shear off part of the state of North Carolina and declare its independence? And third, then, an even deeper issue hinted at, the whole question of the origins, the legitimacy of Republican government. Right? Again, as you read through Alexander Martin's manifesto, this gripe, seemingly, that begins about Indian trade goods and negotiations over land settlement and how many circuit riding judges are present, suddenly develops into this rather dramatic conflict, okay, over the basic stability and purpose of government itself. Right? So when you look at these three pieces of debate, right, and immediately you should notice the connections between the different documents. These are the points about which they are arguing. You get, I think, the sense, wow, I'm peeking into a world that I don't fully understand. Why are these issues so important? Why do these people proceed directly from small administrative points to big, big questions, all right, about the whole nature of government. Right? And in order to understand that, that's when you start looking at, I think, the larger background and context, right, of this time period. First off, that whole question of the Indian trade goods. Okay, why was this so important? Now, obviously, as you look through that, what's implied was that the government of the state of North Carolina, okay, had opened, under its own authority, land sales in a number of areas which the Cherokee chiefs, right, in the towns along the Little Tennessee had agreed to cede to the state of North Carolina in exchange for trade goods. And this was a rather common exchange, not without controversy among the Cherokee. Large amounts of European manufactured goods, cloth, ammunition, alcohol, metal goods, and so on. I'm talking dozens of wagon loads here, in exchange for certain kinds of land cessions. And apparently what the state of North Carolina had done is opened the land office, sold off land to lots of purchasers in North Carolina, then turned around, ceded their western territories to the United States government, and refused to deliver the trade goods that they promised to the Cherokee elders. Now immediately, as you gather from reading John Sevier, that's a problem because the Cherokee are likely, and he argues, have already gone to war over this issue. Right? But it did at that time go to some much deeper questions. Okay? And one of the big ones was, simply put, did native peoples have a right to the land? Right? Did they have a right that Europeans and European governments needed to recognize in a European sense as property, as national territory? And it was during this time period, particularly under British colonial rule, before the Revolution, it was an open point. It wasn't really fully understood or resolved. Okay? The philosophical position among many was, well, you know, native peoples, they just hunt. They don't work the land as farmers. They don't improve it. They're not civilized. They don't, therefore, have a real claim to the land. Okay? And if they don't have a real claim to the land, well, any payment that you make, that's just, you know, a diplomatic courtesy. You need to leave that to the government. Okay? If native peoples had a claim to the land, well, did that mean that they could legally sell it? Legally sell it to who? Right? This was a direct issue in Tennessee, okay? Because particularly back in 1775, a North Carolina judge and land speculator named Richard Henderson had taken several dozen wagon loads of trade goods over the mountains to Sycamore Shoals, okay, and reached a treaty with the Cherokee chiefs in which they sold him, in exchange for all this material, Kentucky and northern Middle Tennessee. Now, this agreement was controversial on a number of levels. First off, the Shawnee didn't like it because they said, wait a minute, Kentucky doesn't belong to the Cherokee. It belongs to us. A lot of people within the Cherokee tribe, particularly Dragging Canoe, right, and his followers, said, hell no, we're not selling our tribal hunting grounds in exchange for, you know, some alcohol. But also it was very controversial in North Carolina and Virginia because the legislatures, okay, in those two colonies at that time said, wait a minute, who told Richard Henderson he could go around buying land from the Indians? Okay. We didn't tell him this was okay. We're not seeing any of the money. Okay. Essentially, Henderson just decided, oh, I'm going to go off myself and buy it myself. Right? With my own funds and for my own purposes. Well, obviously that decision implied at a pretty deep level that he recognized it as their property. And he didn't need to, this wasn't a matter of diplomacy. This wasn't a matter of imperial policy. Okay? They owned it, he could buy it. Right? That sale, of course, then ignited a political firestorm. Virginia opposed it, North Carolina opposed it, right? And Henderson, in time, through a series of difficult negotiations, was stripped of most of it. Okay. But that question, did Native peoples have a right to the land? If they did or they didn't, that turned into the question of who had the right to negotiate with them for it, and in what manner. As I said, it was an open question. It was one thing the Franklinites did. They negotiated on their own, independent of North Carolina. Okay? The diplomacy also led into the military question. Okay? If the question of who interacts with the Indians diplomatically is open, then the question who deals with these people militarily was also up for debate. Remember when the British sent redcoats, right, into the American colonies beginning in 1765. Colonists weren't opposed to them being there. They just thought they were in the wrong place. They needed to be out on the frontier, okay, driving the Indians away so to open it to white settlement, right? Putting it in the port cities, that was a waste of manpower, right? In fact, along with that, one of the things that the British government had done, right, was, as a series, in part of the series of imperial reforms, they stripped away from each of the colonies themselves the right to negotiate with neighboring Indian tribes and go to war with neighboring Indian tribes. And instead, handed it over to two Indian agents, John Stuart for the Southern Department and Sir William Johnson for the Northern Department. And specifically chose a couple of men involved in the Indian trade with no particular connection to colonial governments, and placed both of them a long way away from the centers of colonial political power, so they'd be insulated. This was one of the biggest grievances the colonists had. Right? The empire is taking away a basic right, our right to conduct diplomatic relations with the Indians and our right to go to war with them when we need to. Okay? So understand that whole question about the trade goods here, and North Carolina essentially engaging in Indian diplomacy and then saying, ha-ha, we found a loophole. Okay? We're going to turn the whole thing over to the United States government, and then we're going to run away. The United States government doesn't have the military force to actually protect Western settlers, and Western settlers are going to have to deal with the diplomatic consequences, well, themselves? No, that would be illegal. Okay, they're subjects of the state of North Carolina. Okay, so again, this whole little issue about these trade goods, it has some very deep roots, okay, in the imperial crisis, in Native American, Euro-American relations, right? And the whole question of, okay, what were the status and rights of Native peoples? The second point, that thing about the administration of justice. Again, the way it's normally phrased in most textbooks is that Western settlers, okay, went out onto the frontier in search of land. That's not right. They went out there searching for property. Property and land are two different things. Right? Land is a physical object. Property is a legal abstraction, a series of rights embodied not in the soil and the grass and the trees, but rather embodied in a piece of paper. Okay? A piece of paper. And it was a piece of paper, well, in order for that paper to have any weight, from where did it need to come? From the government. That's what gave that thing weight. All right? In order for people, and the whole purpose of property was less that people wanted to possess land. You could go out and sit on a piece of land and it wouldn't get you much. What you wanted to do was, in the words of the time, improve it. Okay? Cut down the trees, pull out the stumps, plow up the soil, fence it in, get rid of the weeds and the wild animals and replace it with crops and livestock, build houses and barns and outbuildings. Okay? You improved it by laboring in it. The investment, not just of sweat, but of years, okay, that would turn that land into, okay, something that you could rely on, something that you owned. And your great fear, of course, was that, well, what if in losing the property, I lose all that labor, all that work? I need someone to protect that property. And who would do it? Above all, the government. Okay? So this raises a whole question for these people. Why for Western settlers who supposedly want to go out on the frontier like Daniel Boone so they can, live free, are they so fretting that there aren't enough judges around? Well, it comes back to one big issue. Okay? What did it mean for these people if there was no government? There's, for instance, a way to explain the proclamation line of 1763. Again, it's treated in the textbooks as sort of an odd kind of joke. The British just drew a line on the map. But it's not like they built a fence or anything. Americans just ignored it. Well, if Americans just ignored it, and the British didn't do anything to enforce it, why didn't anybody get upset about it? Why was it such an issue? Did this proclamation line have any actual teeth? Well, it did. It did very much have very sharp teeth. Because by drawing that line, what the British government did is essentially say, you know what? West of that line, no government. No government. You can go out there. It's not like we're going to build a wall. But if you do, where are you? Where are you now?
No man's land.
Well, you're any man's land. You can go, as some of those North Carolina settlers, the people who'd gone to the land office, gotten the document from the state of North Carolina, and then marched out with the idea, I'm going to settle this land. You can go out there, and what might the Indians do?
Kill you.
Yeah, cut your scalp off your head.
And nothing you can do about it.
Well, you can shoot back, if you're lucky. The Indians are pretty good shots. Okay? But there's no protection. Okay? British government isn't going to help you. Right? You're where you're not supposed to be. Right? You are past the reach of the state. So sure, you can go out there, you can build your little cabin, chop down your trees, okay? But there's no security for you. At any moment, you could lose all of that. And not just to the Indians, you can lose it to other white people as well. This is something people remembered just before the Revolution down in South Carolina. There's a series of political conflicts in South Carolina. The government, and sort of the planter elite of that colony, down along the seaboard around Charleston, had refused to allow the organization of local governments, parishes, judges, sheriffs, courts, right, in the backcountry, in the upcountry. As a result of that lack of government, then, well, the backcountry of South Carolina became a refuge for all sorts of desperados. Horse thieves, okay, people absconding from their debts, absconding from their wives, absconding from civilization in general.
What do you consider the back country of South Carolina?
Above the fall line.
That's the common definition.
I used to teach in South Carolina, so I've taught the regulator movement a lot.
Yeah.
But it was usually north and west of Columbia. It would be kind of anywhere
Toward the
from
beach or
Oh no, like we're talking
Toward the
toward
mountains.
Greenville.
going to Spartanburg?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like north and west of Columbia.
Toward
So
Blue Ridge.
yeah, toward the Blue Ridge, also Augusta, along the Edgefield district. I mean, along the the Savannah River, all the way up. Basically anything north of the fall line. The fall line is Columbia, which is the state capital.
Yeah,
Anything north of
I'm
there.
from there, I just never heard that, or I don't remember it.
Up country, back country was a common term as well. Sort of gives you, well, an indication of some of the shift in American thinking. If you call that area the back country,
Well, I know we have dark corners in that area.
well, but think about it this way. If it's back there, what direction are you looking? Well, not forward, a geographic direction.
Towards the ocean.
West.
Right?
You're looking east. If the frontier is back there, you're looking east. If you're looking east, where were you looking?
You're looking toward England.
Toward England, toward London. The model, okay? The place where, okay, civilization has its center, power, prosperity, culture, government, okay? Everything else. People out in the West, well, if you turn here right to the first source, number 3, what some members of the North Carolina Assembly were apparently calling people in the Tennessee settlements, what was it? The offscourings of the earth, fugitives from justice.
And they thought that was wonderful, those scours of the earth and the fugitives.
Oh, well, do you notice from that letter any particular pride they're taking in the West in those words? Not at all. This is an insult. You're uncivilized. You're barbarous. You're unruly. You're unlawful. Okay? Fugitives from justice. Everything else. You know the sense here, again. These people didn't want to live in a state of anarchy. They wanted security. Security for their property, security for their labor. Right? And so, in a sense, then, it's a real issue for them, very deep-seated. We want government out here. Okay? We want justice out here. But particularly, as in the case of the South Carolina regulation, what settlers in the upcountry did, since the colony of South Carolina wouldn't let them create courts, elect and pay sheriffs, build jails and things like that, in any kind of official capacity, they went and did it on their own. They formed vigilante groups, called themselves regulators because they were going to regulate, right, their communities and their society. They did it on their own. Okay. That leads us here to the third point. Okay. And you can see, again, the references to the whole question of legitimate government. The South Carolina regulators were so problematic within their society is that they were going around, as I said, engaging in vigilantism. Right? They were horsewhipping people. Right? They were hanging people. Right? With no proper procedure, no proper authority. Were the people they caught guilty? Often yes, sometimes no. Did the people they caught get much of a chance to defend themselves, assert their legal rights through proper procedure? No, no, and no. Okay. This is the substance then of Alexander Martin's charge, which you see here in that final source, the third one. Right? He says, I have thought proper to issue this manifesto, hereby warning all persons concerned in the said revolt, okay, that they return to their duty and allegiance, i.e. to the state of North Carolina, and forbear paying any obedience to any, oh boy, here's the big words, any self-created power and authority. Self-created power and authority, oh boy. Okay. Who was supposed to create power and authority? It's an example I often use with my students. You know, it's who's in charge in my classroom? Yeah, I am, more or less. But why? How did this happen? Did we hold an election? No. Did we fight it out and the best man won? No. Right. Instead, rather, that power was delegated to me by the department, created by the university, created by the state legislature, enabled by the state constitution, created ultimately by the people. Where'd the people get their power? Where'd the people get the idea that they could just go around creating constitutions?
Probably from God.
God, or what's another word that would be used, or was used? Creator. Their creator, who endowed them with this. This gets to a root issue. And I should say, it should set you off right off the bat here, noticing one of the problems about the American Revolution. Condemning self-created power and authority. That's a little rich coming from Alexander Martin. Had he ever been involved in anything like that? The governor of North Carolina in 1785? I don't know. He might have been involved with that notorious rascal Washington in, another case of provinces deciding that they could just go off on their own. Yeah, this is a tough thing. I mean, Martin had served in the North Carolina militia. Okay? He'd served in the Continental Army. He was up to his neck in this sort of thing. Okay? Self-created power and authority. What was the American Republic, after all? You get the odd sense. Look at what this man was suddenly confronted with and trying to do. He's trying to put the genie back in the bottle. Okay? It's gotten out. And he and other men like him had let it out, and now they're faced with the consequences. Okay? Franklin was bad, but Franklin wasn't the only one. There were other groups, other states doing this. The big one, of course, was Vermont. 10 times worse than Franklin. Ethan Allen and his brothers and the Green Mountain Boys had been pulling this kind of stunt all the way back into the 1770s. They wrote their own constitution in 1777 and said, take it or leave it to the American Republic. Okay? And now, as Martin and other staunch Federalists have realized, this idea, it's shown up here. It's shown up here. And you look at the arguments that John Sevier and the Franklin Assemblyman made. Okay? It's straight out of the Declaration of Independence. All right? The Franklin Assemblymen, in the Franklin leadership, they say, well, look, North Carolina abandoned us. Okay? They just abandoned us. Right? We had to do this, as Sevier put it, just out of self-preservation. In other words, to secure our inalienable right to, say, our lives, which are now being threatened by the natives, to our pursuit of happiness, to our liberties, our rights to own property and be secure in our persons and our property through the exercise of government. Right? If the state of North Carolina won't do what a government was supposed to do. Remember, that's what Jefferson had written in the Continental Congress and enacted. Okay? That to secure these rights, governments were instituted among men. That's the purpose of government. Okay? To protect you in your rights, right? Particularly in your property. Here. Okay? If the government wasn't doing it, it was the right of the people to go ahead and create their own. Okay? A government which doesn't govern is no government at all. That's the argument the Westerners made. It's an argument, remember, that they'd made before. Okay? They'd made it in Watauga, right? All the way back in the late 1760s, when settlers found that they had settled below the Fort Stanwix line, and the British government told them, you have to get out. Right? They said, no, we'll stay, and we'll just make up a government of our own and conduct our own negotiations with the Cherokee. Or right here in Middle Tennessee, right? When Henderson hired James Robertson, John Donaldson, to lead an expedition to go settle and prove up his claim to northern Middle Tennessee, when they arrived, what government did they have? They had no government, okay? No legitimate authority. They were acting on behalf of a private land speculator. He had no legal claim, really, to what he was doing. So I said, well, you know, we'll just form a compact. Right? We'll govern ourselves. Right? And of course, from there, you proceed to an easy step, the creation of an independent state of Franklin. Right? After all, hadn't the North Carolina government just declared that they were ceding their western territories to the national state? Hadn't they just absconded from any claim that they were governing this area? Obviously, the people had the right to do this. Not that Tennesseans would ever get this idea buried in their heads. I mean, you know, I don't know. Let's face it, if you were the offscourings of society and a fugitive from justice and just generally unfit for decent human company in Tennessee, where'd you go? Texas. Let's face it, I mean, remember Jim Bowie, okay? Man went to Texas from Louisiana. You know why? He got run out for, corrupt, dodgy land dealings. The man got run out of Louisiana for corruption. No, you're too corrupt for Louisiana. You need to go to Texas.
It's in Houston.
Oh, yeah, well, you know. Oh, gosh, what was the guy's name? The last of the great American filibusterers from the 1850s. The guy.
Webster?
What?
Daniel Webster.
No. William. He organized the expedition from California that went down and seized control of Nicaragua for a couple of years and looted the treasury.
That gray-eyed man of destiny guy.
Not sure. It was William something. I'm blanking on his last name. You could look it up. But remember, he led the expedition of men from California, but where was he born? Nashville.
Oh, William Walker, is that the
William Walker, that's it. Yes.
There's a historical marker to him on Commerce Street.
Absolutely. Who would get the idea that I'll just lead an expedition into a foreign country and just start conducting military operations and judicial proceedings? Where might he have gotten that idea? State of Franklin, or maybe from Andrew Jackson invading Spanish Florida. Okay. So the impact then of Franklin, okay, goes deeper and broader than just the formation of the state of Tennessee. The formation of the state of Tennessee, when you look at this in this context, is less a question of Tennesseans boldly asserting their independence as it is Tennesseans getting the deal that they wanted. Okay? One thing, again, North Carolina finally made its peace with the U.S. government, ceded its western land claims, so that the land west of the Appalachians, with the exception of military warrants and so on, went firmly and irrevocably into the hands of the U.S. government. The U.S. Constitution is also very clear on another point. Indian relations, all of it goes straight to the federal government. No private individuals, okay? No states, no colonies, okay? That's why Indians get casinos. State law does not apply to them. That's clear in the Constitution. Okay, the Constitution was clarifying things here. Central national authority. And from there, state governments, land surveys, everything else, the chain of legitimacy would flow out to people. If you got a piece of land under the Homestead Act, you did not have to question whether it came from a legitimate authority. It came from the U.S. government. Okay? Not for some private land deal, not for some dodgy piece of state diplomacy. Okay? From there then, okay, Tennessee got its first actual self-government with the Southwest Territory. A government under national administration. In fact, the Tennesseans had to cut a compromise. Instead of their hero, John Sevier, they had to accept a North Carolina land speculator, William Blount, as territorial governor. Okay? But as long as Blount brought with him the legitimacy and the authority of the United States government to put that imprimatur on what they were doing, to give them the structure of militia authority, local government, courts, and everything else, Tennesseans were happy to take it. Right? And Tennessee statehood then finally came under the terms of the U.S. Constitution. Okay. You understand that in a sense here, Tennessee statehood, as I said, it's not maybe an assertion of rugged independence, okay, but rather a search for legitimacy, a search for order in a confused and confusing world. In this case, for people, for whites in the Overmountain settlements, it comes from making the link that they wanted to the U.S. authorities. All right, that is all I have. Y'all have any questions?
The one thing, what about the situation on the boundary dispute, Georgia and Tennessee?
They ain't taking our water. Again, this runs into a question that was a rather difficult one for the national government to resolve. To what extent did the older states and older state surveys and legal agreements have, sovereign authority that the U.S. government could not interfere with? And in this case, the argument was that that line is an older survey, okay? And as such, that any changes to the boundaries of states has to be done by the common agreement of the states themselves. Which is why, obviously the U.S. government can't do the rational thing, which would be to consolidate North and South Dakota. Why do we need two separate Dakotas? That's one of the things that makes it a federal republic in this sense, and confuses some issues. But compared to the British imperial administration of the colonies, it's the soul of clarity. Vermont itself, well, again, if I try and describe British colonial administration to my students, the term I always use is half-assed. Who was in charge? They didn't really know. Whose responsibility within the government, were different policy questions. They hadn't really settled it. Vermont emerged because under the old colonial charters, the Green Mountain country, okay, had been granted by the king to New Hampshire and to New York. Okay. So New Hampshire did the logical thing, which was sold off the Green Mountains. New Yorkers didn't like this, so they did the logical thing and sold it off too. And so people showed up with New Hampshire land grants and New York land grants. And because they're civilized Yankees, they didn't just go around shooting each other. Instead, they formed legitimate local governments, elected town councils, appointed sheriffs, and went around arresting each other. Until this got so onerous that many people were willing to turn to the leadership of Ethan Allen and his brothers and simply say, you know what, let's solve this question ourselves. Because heaven knows if they'd sat around waiting for the Board of Trade over in London to resolve it, they all would have been dead. Right? So again, in a sense, you do leave some loose ends, but compared to what had come before, authority, clarity, security.